I, like Mark, want to thank the organizers of this and applaud the work that the research team has done. It really is an honor to be here. And feels like when Mark started off by saying, I'm an historian, it sounded like some sort of confession. And I want to share in that confession and say, I too, I will warn you, I'm an historian. Worse yet, I'm a social historian. So there it is, I put my cards on the table. Even as a social historian who spent a long time studying the pandemic of 1918, I continue to find it very hard to imagine what really happened. I've read thousands of sources, or hundreds of sources, thousands of pages. I've traveled thousands of miles, but that world remains difficult for me to see. As one observer in a small town in Pennsylvania suggested, it would be very difficult for a person who had not been in the homes to imagine how much suffering existed there. Another commentator said, you cannot imagine how it has scourged the country. I want to talk today about what I see as both the promise and the perils of big data, data mining, as we try to better imagine these past worlds, past world that was besieged in 1918 by influenza. Well, one obvious appeal of data mining, and this is obvious for all of you, but was news to me because I don't do this work. But the idea that you can use these digitized sources to do so much so fast. I mean, you can take what for me would take, as you described, I use the same word in my notes, laborious search, and it can be done so much more quickly, but also at such quick cost. To travel all over the country to visit archives, of course, is terribly costly both in time and money. You can see it beautifully in this project. Based in research in over 90 newspapers, the project's reach vastly exceeds in quantity of words anything that I could do or that I have done. The daily newspaper case study, for instance, as I'm just getting started reading the report for the first time and see the researchers were able to explore 2 years of issues from 16 newspapers, resulting in the analysis of 21,000 pages of text. I'm just sitting at my desk and my jaw is dropping. And that's, of course, only one of your case studies. As we see here too, data mining can identify entirely new starting places for research and new avenues of inquiry down which we historians can travel. Again, one example. The weekly papers case study, for instance, identifies patterns in newspaper reportage that seem to cross local and regional boundaries. At the same time, when that case study is juxtaposed with the daily newspapers case study, when we juxtapose that with the weeklies, we see really meaningful differences between the two kinds of publications, dailies and weeklies. And together, these findings raise questions about the role of production and consumption of media in the tension between a growing national culture and a persistent schism within the country between urban and rural settings. I mean, it's really visible in the big data. In turn, this study, this research project, illustrates the promise posed by data mining for testing existing arguments. You can also bring big data to the work that is already being done and ask questions. Especially compelling for me, of course, was the public health officials case study. It's a particularly interesting one, and not only because it may likely prove one of my own arguments incorrect. I sort of expect that to happen. Instead, I found this work really impressive because it was in this case study where I could really see data mining being used on a complex historical question. Right? Not something simple, but something that was multi-layered, not only in the question being asked, but in the approaches applied to it. First, by way of the topic modeling segmentation of 90 newspapers, the study documented the influence of Royal S. Copeland, New York City's Commissioner of Health, not only in his home community, but identifying as well a national impact. Then, through the tag clouds, they were able to suggest that health officials around the country listened to, discussed Copeland's actions. And then, looking at 25 articles that included words by Copeland and conducted tone analysis on 150 sentences, they were able to discover that he engaged in alarmist or warning language slightly more frequently than, but in a pattern consistent with, public health officials around the country. That's an important finding as we're trying to figure out how he factored into the national public health response. Both of those findings then in turn, and this is why I love this case study, then a third methodology is brought to bear on the same question, and they illustrate again that other cities not only were talking about Copeland, but were actually envisioning him as someone who was using effective and aggressive action against the flu in his public health activity. These findings of Copeland's broad influence and authority, of the similarities between his own rhetoric and that of other practitioners, suggest the benefits of a comprehensive exploration of specific issues through data mining. In this case, making really clear the importance of really understanding the words and actions of this guy. So we've been asking those questions. Now we know, in fact, if he may have had a broad national influence, we really need to understand what he was doing and what he was saying. As a side note, I'll admit I'm not entirely convinced that the findings change my own interpretation of his effectiveness. The research on the value of the non-pharmaceutical interventions, or what we call social distancing measures, closing schools, keeping people away from each other, we know that those employed early save lives. So that his tendency, I thought it was really interesting today to see, what you've discovered is that his language changes across time. The problem is that he's using soothing language early and then does the warning alarmist language late. Given that you want people to begin social distancing as early as possible, his behaviors may still have cost lives in New York City. That doesn't make him different from anyone else in the country, but rather makes him consistent, just as you've demonstrated. But again, it doesn't really matter whether we decide his actions were good or bad, effective or ineffective. What's really interesting is how fully this shows us the importance of the research itself. And the study makes very clear that what Copeland was saying and doing was meaningful not only in the city but beyond, and that these are things we need to continue to ask. Put another way, the research methodology employed in this particular case study, for me, allowed us to see the importance of the questions, challenged our thinking about those questions, in this case I'm speaking personally, and urged us on to continued investigations. For me, that's what the best historical work does. It keeps us moving. Now I want to turn to talk about some of the concerns that data mining raised for me. As I said, I want to talk about promise and perils. And I want to note, actually, as I talk about this, that the research team itself is already fully engaged in interrogating their methods, so I'm not saying anything new or anything that they perhaps haven't thought of. They made very clear all the way through the report, and I really enjoyed often those very sections, where you help to see the complexities of your work, the limitations that the methods were imposing on you, and the choices that you were forced to make as you attempted to go forward with the work you were doing. Whether explaining the struggles of poor optical character recognition or the barriers created by proprietary ownership of the digital sources, you were really clearly intent on presenting your research honestly and with a sincere interest in understanding not only the promise but the perils. So it's in that spirit that I want to offer a couple of my own thoughts about the most vexing problems of big data and data mining in this historical research. So data mining allows us to see the broad view, and that's its strength. It allows us to see general trends. It allows us to see things which might be invisible in smaller sets of sources. As you suggested a minute ago, it helps us with the question of representativeness in particular, which is really an important part of our work. Put simply, it helps us see the forest instead of the trees. It allows master narratives to emerge that offer broad strokes of understanding. What I want us to think about for the last few minutes is what's lost in that broad view. As an historian, and as was suggested, a historian of African American history, and somebody particularly interested in social history, I'm deeply committed in my work to opening up the understanding of the silences that exist in our historical record to this point, our knowledge of those whose voices have been rendered silent, their experiences made invisible through the operation of, quite frankly, power and privilege, not only in the lives that they lived, but in the way stories are recorded for those who come later. So as I think about big data and data mining, I inevitably ask whether this approach can better help us hear these voices and narratives that they have to share. My concern is that this approach risks doing the opposite. Put another way, my question is simply, whose voices will be audible through big data? In the case of this project, while data mining allowed a remarkable number of sources to be engaged, those sources still reflect a pretty particular and distinct set of communities. English-speaking, largely white, certainly literate. Are there big data sources available to access a broader array of voices than we hear in this study? As the research team notes, absolutely. In fact, African American newspapers do exist from this era, and they exist all over the country. They're difficult to get, but they are in fact available. Most of them are not yet digitized, but some of them are. Some are even available in Chronicling America. Perhaps elements of this study could be replicated, employing a broader array of sources, and we'd see additional meaningful insights. The more voices you can get into the study, the more you can learn. Obviously, this was the first step in a study. Though barriers of proprietary ownership make it complicated and costly, those barriers, I would argue, are worth overcoming. Just imagine how much more we could know by including the African American press in this investigation. Similarly, Alan Kraut, an historian of immigrant experience in the U.S., has shown the distinctive experience of immigrant communities in an essay in Public Health Reports published in 2011. And he helped us look specifically at Southern Italian and Eastern European Jewish immigrant communities and discovered that the way they used their newspapers was very different from the way other communities use their newspapers. Because of cultural insensitivity and language barriers, they needed newspapers that spoke to them literally and figuratively in their own language. In that case, then, the immigrant press as well seems vital to engage. The problem is that there are many populations for whom big data simply will not exist. As Michel Rolfe-Pouillot suggests in Silencing the Past, Power on the Production of History, the production of historical narratives involves the uneven contribution of competing groups and individuals who have unequal access to the means for such production. Put another way, some people are less likely to have had the opportunity to leave the kinds of sources that we can access. That means we need to use innovation to access them. As we look back at 1918, we have to recognize that some populations simply didn't have the resources, the organization, or the power to make the creation of big data possible. Think, for instance, of tribal communities in the US, or of the rural poor, African American sharecroppers in Mississippi, Latino farm workers in Texas, immigrants, European descended poor white people in Kentucky. Big data will by nature exclude any understanding of those groups. This exclusion is further facilitated by the tendency towards generalizing that is in some ways the very purpose of big data. Data mining allows researchers to reach general conclusions, to make broad claims, in this case about American and Canadian experiences in the influenza pandemic. And yet such research also has an inherent tendency to flatten the particularities. In fact, that's its role, to flatten the particularities, but not only of individuals' experiences, but I would argue the experiences of groups whose stories fall outside the dominant storyline, even when their voices are theoretically included in the data. For instance, in the weekly newspaper case study, we discovered something really important through the tag clouds, that, quote, family relations and activities were an important part of reporting on the influenza, as news about individual victims was widely disseminated through these newspapers. And further, that these individual victims can be identified as soldiers in the tag clouds. Well, such a finding is certainly meaningful, but it also conceals other victims whose stories were told in these same newspapers. The columns of weeklies, as you've seen today, are filled with these local items. In fact, it's incredibly trying when you're trying to get to the story of small town United States, and those are the papers you have available to you, because to find the references to influenza is very, very difficult. Again, why data mining makes so much sense to me. The problem is when you start to read those, you realize that the people who are separated and whose accounts of illnesses and deaths appear in those local references aren't only soldiers, but they're daughters and bankers and church members and the farmer down the street or the shopkeeper, a point that's made later in the daily newspaper case study. So this simple example doesn't trouble me particularly, but it hits at a broader problem of data mining, its tendency to obscure. In data mining, dominant voices will be those of the mainstream, and too often those, I fear, of those that have the resources and the power to leave a record. As we turn to this new technology and methodology, we've got to be careful that it doesn't return us to the landscape historians have been working hard for many decades to leave behind, a geography of the United States and more broadly of North America, people only by those with economic, social, and cultural means to make their voices heard in the historical record, the white, the well-to-do, the literate, the English speakers. There's so many questions we still need to answer about what happened in 1918. Questions that I actually do think are relevant to public health today that can help us manage that next pandemic that we all fear. But we need to be thinking about managing those next pandemics not only in ways that are effective, but also equitable. So these questions still strike me as really important. How did class shape the experiences of Americans during the pandemic? Was access to health care based in part on one's ability to pay? What of the rural poor who were castigated by the Red Cross for their poverty and the resulting conditions in which they lived? Did assumptions about them and their values and habits shape the way they were treated by the Red Cross and the kind of resources that they had access to? What about the operation of race? I know from Professor Gamble's work, and I'm sorry she didn't get to share her thinking with you today, but her work shows us really clearly how segregated healthcare troubled the experiences of African Americans during the pandemic. What of other communities of color? I know from my own research how horrific the experiences of the pandemic were on reservations and again in Indian schools. How did cultural animosity interfere with the distribution of information and resources? And again, Alan Kraut has taught us something about immigrant communities, but only two, and there are so many more to know about. If we want to make our historical work relevant for policymaking, for me, these kinds of questions still need answers. So, as we imagine the possibilities of data mining for historical work, we've got to continue to ask ourselves what it can, but also what it cannot teach us. What questions will it allow us to answer? But also what questions will it allow us to not only not answer, but in fact evade? Whose voices will tell the stories of the past, and whose voices will again be rendered silent? Whose faces will appear in the broad strokes of knowledge, and whose will disappear? Now again, from the very beginning of the report, the authors acknowledge that data mining cannot substitute for close or manual reading of discrete texts. Put simply, the research team doesn't suggest that data mining should replace historical research of the old-fashioned kind, but imagines instead the benefits of the complementary and intersecting use of these two approaches. And I absolutely agree. The report's introduction concludes by noting that the researchers find themselves, quote, continually compelled by the possibilities of the next step. I'll say that again, it's a great line. They find themselves continually compelled by the possibilities of the next step. With these cautions in place, I share their anticipation. The interdisciplinarity of this research team strikes me as what is at the heart of its greatness, the heart of its ability to help us see old things in new ways. Inevitably, that interdisciplinarity carries with it great tension, and I think the two of us have as a responsibility to point out some of those tensions. But it also strikes me that the best history, again, happens at those sites of tension. So I look forward to seeing where this project goes from here. Thank you.